Welcome to Churchill, the finest half hour, and the summer of 1940, months of disaster and defiance.
When Winston Churchill was at his most desperate and his very greatest.
When Churchill told Britain's people he had nothing to offer them but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It's the story of Britain's new Prime Minister facing catastrophe here on Churchill, the finest half hour. Hello, I'm Richard Toye, and with me is my good friend, Warren Dockter. How are you doing, Warren?
I'm great.
Ready to get Churchill-y?
Oh yeah, I'm ready. Let's jump in. Let's jump into the summer of 1940.
Well, let's even start with the late spring. So on the 10th of May, 1940, Churchill had taken office as Prime Minister, was immediately facing military disaster, really, in France. And he had to deal with the fact that on the very day that he became Prime Minister, Germany had invaded the Low Countries and very, very quickly was making dramatic military progress.
So he becomes the premier on the 10th of May. I guess in many ways, this is the actual absolute moment for Winston Churchill as he's stepping in. He said he went to bed that night after he was made Prime Minister with a profound sense of relief. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial.
Yeah, he felt that when he went to bed at 3 a.m. So that was actually the 11th of May. And that kind of shows how busy he immediately was already starting to meet with other politicians to send out decisions. And one of the striking things about his government is actually how quickly it is formed. Now, it does take a number of days until all ministers are in place, but people at the time do comment on kind of the rapidity, particularly in comparison, for example, to what had happened in 1915, when Churchill had been part of a government and lost his job as First Lord of the Admiralty. This time, everything is kind of bang, bang, bang.
Certainly, if you look back at the First World War, Asquith, who loved his committees, didn't do anything quickly. And I think that irritated Churchill. You can see lots of things in the way Churchill managed the war that I think illustrated lessons he learned from the First World War. And one of those things was about to act decisively and with speed. You can see that as soon as he steps into the office, he's doing things. And like you say, he went to bed that night at 3 a.m. It was actually May the 11th. And that was when the hour he was walking with destiny. Interestingly, I had recommended to Andrew Roberts that he named his book A Profound Sense of Relief, but he opted for Walking with Destiny. I don't know what that's about.
So the other thing which is notable, of course, is again following the example of the First World War, is in some ways Churchill follows the example of Lloyd George in creating a small 5-man war cabinet. And what is important here is that on the one hand, he includes the Labour Party leaders, the leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, and the deputy leader, Arthur Greenwood. So that was really crucial for demonstrating national unity. But at the same time, he includes political rivals as well. So Neville Chamberlain, of course, had been Prime Minister. What is often forgotten or overlooked is that he continued in the War Cabinet with the title of Lord President of the Council, and also remained leader of the Conservative Party.
And I think that's really remarkable. Churchill was willing to bring the whole group together and have a kind of national government in a literal sense, that everyone was represented, even people from a different political spectrum than him, which I think speaks to his character.
Yeah, I mean, he's very proud of the fact that he has a kind of politically wide-ranging government. He said it from Ellen Wilkinson, the Labour MP on the left, to Lord Lloyd of Dollar Brown, a kind of sort of right-wing, die-hard imperialist on the right. So that's a conscious political choice, but it's not only about reaching out. It's kind of about a matter of political survival.
Right. I think that's really key. So he's got this tent, and he goes to his critics, and he asks them to join and to get in the tent. And so by doing that, it's almost like you can't criticize what we're doing, right? I mean, politically, it's like, hey, you're a part of this operation. We're all in this thing together.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that at this time, people didn't necessarily know this government was going to survive. I mean, we now know, of course, that it lasted until, really until the end of the war in Europe. But it could well have broken down. There were times later on in the war, particularly 1942, when it looked like the MPs were lacking confidence in it. Churchill might not necessarily survive as prime minister. And of course, with these terrible events unfolding in Europe, with these very rapid advances, the French defeat at Sedan, people are thinking, well, is he going to be prime minister maybe just for a matter of weeks? There was certainly no guarantee he was going to be there for years. So there is a lot of not only military decision-making that has to be done, there has to be clever political decision-making too.
Yeah, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know that Churchill's secure there till the end of the war. Well, not literally the end of the war, but for most of the war. And it almost seems counterintuitive to think, it actually at the time looks like Churchill may be there for a matter of months, maybe less, because things are going so poorly so quickly. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And so speaking about things going poorly, if we zoom back out to where Parliament is, where Britain is, Churchill's just sort of navigated the Norwegian campaign, or the fiasco, right? And the question is what now? I mean, now that France is in the process of capitulating, and again, they don't know that exactly at the time, but it looks that way. How does Churchill survive? I mean, what's the next move?
Well, it's just kind of worth dwelling on some of these defeats and the news that Churchill is getting. So within a few days of becoming prime minister, he's having Paul Reynaud, the French prime minister, ringing him up and saying, well, it's kind of all over. We're defeated. That there'd been the Battle of Sedan starts on 12th of May, and the Germans really win it incredibly quickly and cross the Meuse, which something was expected to take them 4 days to do that. They did it in 24 hours. There are battles in Belgium, the Netherlands. The Germans do suffer occasional reverses, but it is just really an unremitting series of defeats. And I think it is worth emphasizing, again, with the benefit of hindsight, people didn't know how quickly this was all going to be over, actually. And Churchill was still, he had to be optimistic to think that the situation could be rescued. And at the beginning, he was optimistic.
And I think it also is useful for us to pause here and think, I wonder to what extent is Germany so successful in this because of the tactical sophistication of the actual blitzkrieg, which I think is one of the reasons they were able to cross the Meuse within 24 hours, which was unthinkable right at the time.
And so Churchill is dealing with this. His bad news. He's having to get on with constructing his government, including political opponents like Chamberlain. He is rewarding to some extent people like Leo Amery, who he made Secretary of State for India, Harold Macmillan, backbench dissident who becomes a junior minister at the Ministry of Supply. But also the other thing that Churchill has to do is to try and get his message across to the public. This is something we obviously associate with him. People sometimes get the impression that he was on the radio every night, inspiring the British people. Of course, he wasn't, because the speeches took a certain amount of time to prepare. He put an awful lot of effort into those. And perhaps his most famous speech, though it has some rivals, is the one that he gives on 13th of May, 1940.
And I think just a couple points to you there that I want to mention is that it's incredible to me, if you've ever seen, and this is worth going to Cambridge to the Churchill Archives to see in person, because it's kind of life-changing if you're a history nerd like us. The way Churchill would write these speeches, he would do it longhand, and then he would dictate it, and it would be written, but he did it on these little cards, and it's almost written out like Bible verses so that he knew where to put the emphasis in the language. And, all of his expertise, and if you've ever read his essay, The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, how to work the crowds, how to use language like a weapon, all of the acumen in his language comes down to these opening speeches. And this one in particular, he spent the day sort of setting the political house the way he needs to. He's, like you say, he's brought in allies, he's brought in enemies, but he still has to make his case to the British public.
Right. And of course, this first speech is to Parliament on the 13th of May. And it's the very famous one. Everyone will know the phrase, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat. And actually, this part of the speech, justifiably famous, is really the only bit which is what you would call sort of highly rhetorical. Most of it is kind of a description of who's been appointed to what posts and so on. So he gives a kind of quite sort of matter-of-fact statement and then goes into this emotional and inspiring speech. But also, I think what's equally crucial in this speech is what is our policy? And he answers with the word victory, which is, again, a sort of a defining statement. because in a way it might seem obvious you're going to search for victory in a war, but obviously you can also seek a compromise peace or a rapid settlement. I think that he is also not knowing how he's going to achieve that victory. And I think he probably would have been sort of honest about that, because he often makes the point that in the First World War, which he had gone through for a large part of it as a government minister, people hadn't known how victory was going to be achieved. There'd been lots of setbacks. There had been long periods where it really wasn't clear how Britain might win. And then finally in 1918, that the Germans had collapsed very rapidly. So he's really saying, we just got to keep on fighting, basically. So victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. And that kind of fits in with his worldview. He equates the British Empire with human progress, a contestable claim, one might say, but certainly one which is in line with his previous rhetoric.
I mean, this again comes down to that kind of gift of language. He has made Britain the champion of civilization, of all humanity, right? It's also, in a way, a kind of low-key call for alliances beyond the seas. I mean, if Britain is holding fast against this tyrannical onslaught and representing human progress or civilization, Western civilization, as Churchill would often say, they would need allies. And the other thing that I think is interesting just to go back to the first point, victory at all costs. The settled peace is still on the table for many people, but he's saying from the get-go that the only thing we'll settle for is unconditional surrender of the enemy. We will win this, and we'll determine what the terms are. And I think that's a remarkable thing, given how catastrophically bad things have gone for him and for Britain over the last 24 hours.
Yes, absolutely. Although I would emphasize that people always think, well, his job was to persuade the British people not to give up. Well, it hadn't occurred to anybody in Britain to give up at this point, because they didn't know how bad things were. And so actually part of his task was to say, without making them despair, kind of saying, hey guys, things are pretty serious. Right. So he has to define the problem, confronting people with reality while trying to ensure that people don't find reality depressing. Well, of course, sometimes in reality, they do find reality depressing.
Right.
Of course, Churchill has been kind of preparing for these kinds of orations for much of his career. You say he'd been reflecting on rhetoric since he wrote that essay, The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, as a young man. And some of these phrases had been tried out this very morning, so that he's in Downing Street, he's inviting people who he wants to be government ministers to come in and give them a job. And one of these MPs, a guy called Malcolm MacDonald, comes in and Churchill sort of says to him, I have nothing to offer you at blood, toil, tears and sweat. And he thinks, am I being offered the post of Minister of Blood, Toil, Tears and Sweat? Equally, I think it's also worth saying that you might think, it's obviously a brilliant speech, you might think that the papers would, the next day would be like, Churchill makes brilliant speech. Not really. They report what he says is there, but it isn't like man makes most amazing speech ever made in history.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, there's not a very strong evidence of popular reaction to it. Of course, this was a speech made in the House of Commons, so it wasn't something which Churchill broadcast. It didn't go directly to the people. They would have read it in their newspapers or heard it reported on the radio, an announcer reading it out. So it doesn't actually have the big impact that you would expect it to just from reading the words.
And what's also interesting is the response in the House was kind of lukewarm, right? Because Chamberlain even got an even bigger cheer than Churchill did.
Right, so that there are a bunch of people who might well have regretted the fact that Churchill had become Prime Minister. There were certainly all the people who had supported Chamberlain in the Norway debate. There were those who had maybe abstained or voted against, and they wanted a change in government, they wanted reconstructed, but still with Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. So poor Neville, I think, when he's lost his job, he comes in the House, he's kind of been usurped, if you like, by Churchill, who a lot of people are very suspicious of. And so that kind of accounts for his warm reception. And so I think that makes the point that Churchill just had this great triumph of becoming Prime Minister, but at a terrible moment, and at a moment where he cannot be entirely sure of unanimous political support, even from all those in his own party.
Well, that sounds like a good point to take a break. When we come back, Churchill's first days as Prime Minister get even more dramatic. Welcome back to Churchill, the finest half hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me is Professor Richard Toye.
And so we had got as far as 13th of May 1940 with Churchill's famous blood, toil, tears and sweat speech. And the situation just kind of continues to get worse from the military perspective. A lot of people think that the French were kind of too impetuous in their military strategy. The Germans certainly make a breakthrough through using surprise tactics. On the 15th of May, Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister, telephones Churchill and says, the German army has broken through our fortified line south of Sedan. And this is obviously incredibly shocking news. The Dutch forces surrender very quickly after that. And there's really a kind of systemic failure on the part of the Allied forces. And really, this is such a chaotic situation that is essential that the British try and find out really what's going on. And it's worth sort of dwelling on the fact that really the French had not been very communicative with the British in terms of even telling them where their forces were deployed. That's obviously something you expect your ally to know. The French generals weren't telling their own politicians what they were doing because they were terrified of leaks, basically. So you've got this situation of chaos and of Churchill needing to be on the spot to actually find out what's going on. And that's why he decides to go to see for himself.
But I can't help but reflect on the fact that it's almost like it was an elaborate bluff that France had appeared so strong to Germany for so long and to the rest of Europe. And then when the actual attack occurs, there's such a breakdown in communication on the French side. And not just in communication, but also in terms of intelligence, military intelligence, being able to track and determine where the enemy is on the field. It sort of isn't there.
Well, I think it's also worth thinking about sort of the joint Allied strategy, insofar as the British approach was not to send huge numbers of men to France to fight in the trenches in some kind of rerun of the First World War. Rather, what they wanted to do was enforce a naval blockade and hope that the Germans would collapse. That was what the British strategy had really been predicated on in the phony war period from the autumn of 1939 through April 1940. Now, there was this famous statement that Churchill made in the late 1930s, which was kind of seen as shocking at the time, where he said, "Thank God for the French army." What he was saying, well, we, the British, are not sufficiently prepared. We haven't got enough forces. So thank God that there's this brilliant military machine, the French army. Now, in retrospect, you think, well, maybe the French army wasn't so brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly there were. The Germans did have good equipment. They did have well-trained men. They did have a method of moving much more rapidly with tanks and armored vehicles. Don't forget, of course, that there was still actually a significant number of people moving with horses as well. So there was not an absolute transformation of these military forces into modernized forces, but certainly from the perspective of how it appeared to be when you're on the receiving end, then, of course, the tanks crashing through the Ardennes forest, making sweeping progress much faster really than anything was achieved during the First World War. Just a terrible psychological blow, really, as well as a military one.
And so from the Allied perspective, you can see why on May 16th, after these sort of repeated catastrophic failures, Churchill's like, I need to go be the man on the spot, which again harkens back, I think, to experiences that he had in the First World War, where he thought, oh, if I had just only been there at the Dardanelles or at Gallipoli, it would have been different. So he personally decides to go to France.
Well, that is very typical for him. And of course, he's quite keen on flying. He had himself trained as a pilot. And as you rightly say, he often felt, I mean, whether it was sort of diplomatically or militarily, that his presence was essential. I mean, arguably, in this case, he was very much right. There were certain things you'd only get a real perspective on the situation by literally seeing what was going on with your own eyes, when the French were often being so unhelpful and uncommunicative. I mean, that may be what I'm saying sounds like a very British interpretation, and the French certainly had their own views in a way, the French view would be, well, you're kind of not really providing very many forces. You can't really expect to be consulted to that degree. But I want to do our little feature, which I call Document Surprise at this point, where I surprise you with a document and you tell me how surprised you are, or indeed how amusing you find the document, because this one is in places quite funny. Have you heard of a guy called Otto Lund?
Yeah, Otto Lund, he was a soldier. I think he served in the First World War, and then he was a deputy director of the military operations at the War Office briefly, right?
That's right. So this is exactly at this period that he is making these visits to France and Belgium in May and June 1940. And Otto Lund starts off by talking about his dissatisfaction with the French and their lack of communicativeness.
Okay.
But then one of our best bits from our point of view is when he talks about Winston's flying technique, in which he goes on about how he put on his overcoat, got in the plane, wrapped a rug around his legs, and then took something black out of his pocket. And this black thing turns out basically be a kind of eye mask that he puts over his eyes. As soon as he puts it on, he just goes straight to sleep. He says, no matter how hard the blow, how bad the news, the Prime Minister can always summon the great reviver's sleep. It seems to be God's good gift to the gifted. And so the moment he touches the ground, he just wakes up again, and off they go to the British Embassy in Paris. So he says that people were going about their business looking sort of quite normal. And so he's like, okay, that seems good. Nobody's panicking. But later on, Lund figures out that this is just because people don't know what's going on because of the censorship. They're just unaware of how bad the situation is. And then the ambassador offers the Prime Minister a cup of tea. And he says, Winston looked aghast at the situation. Sir Ronald Campbell, the ambassador, ordered whiskey and soda. And then we went straight off to the Quai d'Orsay, that is the French Foreign Ministry. Very windy day. There's all this paper flying around, and basically there's a guy in the back garden of the Foreign Ministry who's burning the archives.
Oh my God, that's never a good sign, by the way.
So then we get to Paul Reynaud's study. Again, remember, he's the Prime Minister. With him, General Gamelin, who, according to Lund, is dejection personified.
And Gamelin was the French Army Commander-in-Chief?
He was indeed. And Lund says, the procedure at these meetings with the French was always the same. We would start off very correctly with an interpreter and by keeping minutes. Winston would stick this for just about a quarter of an hour, and then his impatience would break through. He would start to declaim in the most astounding and surprising French, waving his hands and repeating time after time a particularly pleasing phrase that he would get hold of. So literal a translation of the English was it that even I could understand it. The accent had to be heard to be believed.
Well, so we've heard your impersonation of Winston Churchill, Richard, and now you have to do it in French.
Well, all right. I'm not promising anything, but the next bit describes how, on this occasion, the Prime Minister sensed the defeatist attitude of Gamelin, and he's getting more and more irritated. And so Lund describes Churchill's reaction. He says, on this occasion, his theory quite rightly was that of an attack. That's written in big capital letters. Attack, attack, attack. That's what we must do, attack. What did it matter if the French had a slight reverse on the Meuse? Fill up the gap with reserves. What did a slight reverse matter? Attack all the time. We could do the same in Belgium. Attack. They must pull up their socks. And then he got hold of an expression which so fascinated him that he repeated it over and over again. Our Air Force will nettoyer le ciel, so clean the sky. And he waved his hands with a broad sweeping gesture. Nettoyer le ciel, comprenez-vous? Nettoyer le ciel. And the French must, in cooperation with us, attack and attack. Again and again.
And I guess my next question is, Churchill's still telling them that they're going to clear the sky, right? He must still have quite a bit of faith in the French army at that point.
Well, the shocking moment, this is London going on. When this tirade was over, Reynaud said he quite agreed. So Reynaud actually seems relatively upbeat and positive. He still seemed to have a lot of drive left in him. And then Gamelin made his only contribution to the meeting, historic in my opinion. Quotation from Gamelin: "We have no reserves. There is nothing between Paris and the leading elements of the German armoured divisions, no more and no less." So in Churchill's memoirs, that even becomes shorter. Churchill says, "Where is the strategic reserve?" And General Gamelin says, "Oh, come, none. We haven't got any." So this basically confirms from a different source what Churchill says in his memoirs. And And Lund says, interesting description, after this surprising statement, Winston remained quite calm with always that pugnacious spirit. Churchill goes on and asks more questions. Where was the Ninth Army? Nobody can explain where it is. It seems to have disappeared. And then there's sort of a whole story which follows on from this, where they stay in France overnight. And that evening, they dine at the embassy. Winston, in great form, gay as a cricket, drinking brandy, smoking cigars, never for one moment doubtful that everything would be all right in the end. There's a whole debate about whether or not the British cabinet should send more fighters to help the French, more aircraft. And of course, the danger of doing that is that if they get shot down, then those fighters are not going to be available to defend Britain if the worst comes to the worst. They do agree to send a couple of squadrons. There's got to be consultation. Churchill can't just snap his fingers and make it happen. He has to communicate back and forth. And then they try to get hold of Reynaud again. Eventually, they go round to Reynaud's flat to tell him what's been decided, but they get there before Reynaud's mistress can shoot out the back door. So she is hiding in one of the bedrooms while they're having all these ongoing discussions in this rather small flat. So that's the chaotic, in some ways, if it wasn't so serious, sort of comical situation in which Churchill finds himself on the evening of 16th of May before flying back to London the next day.
It's really cool that you found Otto Lund, by the way. Good work.
Well, thank you. So we've got to the middle of May and things are looking bleak. Churchill remains confident, optimistic. He is determined to stay on the attack. But the question is, what's going to happen next? And will Churchill get the political support he needs from his ministerial colleagues at home? So Churchill's painfully aware of the scale of the disaster in France. But can anything turn the tide?
Or will members of Churchill's own war cabinet argue that it's time to explore making peace with the Nazis? Find out next time on Churchill, The Finest Half Hour, available wherever you get your podcasts.
And in the meantime, KBO.